Are we good to go? All right. All right, well, let's get started. You having a good mix, everyone? Yeah, all right. Yeah, it's been good. Actually, I've been really I thought all the keynotes were really great, and I've been really enjoying myself. So anyway, my name's Jim, and I'm from the Cloud Computing Tools team. And I'm here to talk to you about the Windows Azure tools. And what the Windows Azure tools are is an extension for that extends Visual Studio to provide support for building cloud services for Windows Azure. So, and the way we think about the tools is this. What we really want to do is help the developer be successful and also be very productive when they're developing applications for Windows Azure. The way we think about it is we think about it in terms of this, what we call our developer lifecycle. So the developer wants to get started on a new platform, give it a try. So how do they get that first project going? How do they get the tools, actually, even before that? And then after they get that first project going, they go through this iterative cycle, this edit, build, debug, test, edit, build, debug again. And then at the end of that cycle, you go into this kind of publish and deploy, and in this case, bring it up on Windows Azure. So keeping that life cycle in mind, what I want to do is actually give you a demo of how that life cycle looks for within these Windows Azure tools and when you're building cloud services that target Windows Azure. All right, so I'm going to flip over here, and I'm going to start on a page that everyone mentions, but actually no one showed, which is azure.com or microsoft.com/Azure. Now, on this page, the key thing that you want to look at is this thing on the bottom right that says Try It Now. If you click on that, you're taken to this page where there's a couple of real interesting things for you. The first thing is, well, this is where you can actually download the tools in the SDK. As of the MIX release, or the March 2009 CTP, the tools actually also install the SDK. That wasn't true in the past, but it's true now. So for 95% of you or so, I like to think, that's the one that you want to get, and it'll just install everything for you, give you a better install experience. The second thing is register for Azure services. This is where you can get a token. So if you go to the developer portal where you can actually upload your cloud service, you actually have the ability to create a hosted service project and get everything working on the cloud. Highly recommend doing it if you haven't done it. It's fun. Even if you do something silly, you just all of a sudden it's up on the internet, and you're going to get digged, and you're going to get tons of hits. It's going to be great. But okay, in all seriousness, it is fun, and you should give it a try. And more importantly, you can do it all for free today. It's all CTP. It's all trial. And even if you don't have Visual Studio or you're not a Visual Studio developer, that's fine. You can get a free version of Visual Studio called Visual Web Developer Express. Our tools work in that. That includes SQL Server Express. The tools and SDK are free, and the token is free. So end to end, you can do the whole thing, give it a try, get something on the internet all for free today. And so that's a lot of fun, so definitely give that a try. All right, now I'm going to exit that. I'm going to exit this, and I'm going to bring up Visual Studio. I already have the tools installed. So when I go here to File New Project, which is how I create a new project in Visual Studio and get started, I'm brought to this page where I can specify what kind of template I want to use for this project. Now, since I have the tools installed, under both the Visual Basic and the C# nodes in this project type, under project types here, I now have this cloud service node. And this is new. So this allows me to select what type of cloud service I want to create. And I can create a web worker or web and worker. Now, these combinations actually refer to what roles I want to have out of the gate in the cloud service. Now, roles are actually, just think of them as processes, or some people refer to them as components that are running in cloud. To make it even simpler, it's your content and binaries that you want to have running on Microsoft data centers. Okay, so there's a web version of that, which, heck, in this audience, you all know what that is. It has an HTTP endpoint, or maybe HTTPS, or both. And it serves up a UI for people to look at. The worker, you may or may not understand what that is. On Windows, in the Windows Azure context, I should say, a worker project is actually, think of it as a background service. It has an entry point that calls into your code, and that's it. So in your code, at that point, you can write all the managed code you want. and you can do anything you want, and it runs on Microsoft data centers. So I'm going to start here with a web cloud service, and I click OK, and that's going to do a couple things for me. So it's going to create this solution, and it's going to put two projects in there. One is a cloud service project, and the other is this web role, because I just chose I want a web cloud service. So the cloud service, and you can see here it's bolded, is actually the bolded means that it's a startup project, which means when I hit F5 or Control F5, like run or debug, this project takes over and says, hey, I know what to do with that, and I'm going to do a bunch of things that are particular to Windows Azure. The other project here, the web role, is actually just an ASP.NET web application project, the one that you know and love, and it's almost the same. And I'll talk about what a couple differences are in that project. But the key point here is actually if you know ASP.NET, if you know how to develop for ASP.NET, you can leverage that skill in the Windows Azure world. All right, so going back here to the cloud service, you can see that there are a few things going on here. One is this roles node. And the roles node actually has is a representation of the role configuration or topology of your cloud service. And like I said, I'm going back to this, I have a web role, and this icon here says, hey, web role, use this project. And it has a project reference out to this cloud service 2_web role. And that points nicely down to this project. So it says, use this project for the web role. Likewise, I wasn't locked in by the decision I made up front. I don't have to go back and say, file new project, because I want a web and a worker. I can just go here, right-click on the roles node, I click Add, and I can say New Worker. Now, it gives me an option here to choose the template I want to use for the worker. We have a VB and C#, one of those. You can also download and install F#, and you'll get an F# version of the worker as well for all you F# lovers out there. All right, so I'm going to click OK, and that's going to add a worker role. And you'll notice on this roles node, I got added another node which says, here's your worker role for this cloud service. And it's pointing to this worker role 1, which is this project down here that just got added. So that is showing the configuration. And if I go to the service definition file, you can see that that configuration is represented in this file, which is actually a definition of the cloud service. And that includes like metadata information as well, and as well as the role topology or role configuration, such as that there is a web role and there is a worker role. And other information like, well, on the web role, there's some input endpoints. And if I wanted HTTPS, I would add another input endpoint that says, hey, I also have an HTTPS endpoint. The final file in here is the service configuration. Now, this is the settings for your roles. So you can see that these are split up by web role and worker role. And you can see that I have various settings that I can set. And the key point here with this file is you can change this file after your service is already running up in the cloud, and it'll pick up the new values. And one of the great ways that you can make use of this in the cloud is, hey, I have an instant count of 1, and I'm getting tons of traffic. And I'm almost at max capacity. I need to double that capacity, so I'll just change that to 2. Now, if I was doing this in the cloud off the portal, that would actually spin up a second VM and double the capacity of your website. Just as easy as that. All right, so going back to cloud, the service definition, I'm going to show you some of the runtime APIs. Actually, before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about what's different here on some of these projects. So this is an ASP.NET web application. And this is a class library. The worker is just a class library. So what's different? Well, both of these projects actually have references to this Microsoft.servicehosting.serviceruntime.dll. We like short names. And so that library provides the Windows Azure specific API for interacting with your application. So things like logging as well as configuration APIs are in there. There's a local storage type API if you want to do some caching. That's available through that API, and it is Windows Azure specific. We have some project properties that help us identify and tool around this. So if you try just a regular ASP.NET web application and try to set that as a web role, you're not going to be able to do that without a couple of tweaks, which actually on my blog, which is in the resources, you can see how to do that later. All right. So now that I have this class library and worker role going, and I've talked a little bit about this Windows Azure specific API, and I've showed this kind of project creation part of the developer experience. I'm going to move on to this kind of iterative edit, build, debug cycle or part of the developer experience. And to do that, and as part of doing that, I want to show you the usage of some of these Windows Azure specific APIs. So in the service definition file under here, I'm going to add a configuration settings node. And under there, I'm going to add a setting. And I'm going to say, I have a setting, and its name is message. Okay? Under the service configuration file, I'm going to go and say, for that setting, whose name is message, I'm going to give it a value. And that value will be hello from Windows Azure. Okay. Now, I open up default.aspx. And I'm just going to do something simple here. Bring it up in design time. Drop a button, and double-click it so I can get an event handler and write some code behind code. All right, now here's where I actually end up using that role manager API. And I'm going to write to log. So write to log has, as a first parameter, a log level or log name. And there's different ones that you can use: critical, error, warning, information, and verbose. Now, it's important to note, actually, the critical log level is you can actually, when you get a critical alert, you can actually configure through Windows Live Alerts to get an alert back, say, on your cell phone through a text message. You can get an email, or you can get a IM message, however you want to configure it, and it'll pass the message that you want. So for the sake of this demo, I'm just going to use information. And then for the second parameter, which is the actual message, I'm going to show this get configuration setting API, which I'm going to pass, hey, give me that message setting that we just talked about, which is just a string. And I close that off, and I'm going to set a breakpoint on there to show you what happens during debugging. Okay, so I hit F5, and a couple things are happening here under the hood. One, if the development storage isn't running, and the development storage is a local simulation of the the storage API in the cloud of Windows Azure Storage. If it's not running, we'll run it for you so that you can actually make use of that service locally. If the development fabric, which is a local version of the fabric, isn't running, we run that as well. Now, the fabric is the controller guy. He knows how to take a service package and say, OK, well, I know how to unpack that and get at the roles and run them in the cloud. So he's kind of the mastermind behind the whole thing in the cloud. All right. So, never pay no attention to that. So with that, everything's running. And you can see my button. And actually, I'll bring up the Development Fabric UI now. And you can see here that this guy knew how to take that service package, take the cloud service, pack it open, and you recall I changed the instance count of my web role from 1 to 2. So I actually have 2 web role instances running and 1 worker role instance. Now, you can watch your logs from here. And you can see there is a little bit of information from the system saying, hey, your role was started and everything's going. And you can also filter a little bit on the logging level. All right, so you can use that to watch what's going on. So what we should see when I hit this button is that I'll get that log message, right? So I hit the button, and I actually hit a breakpoint just as we expect. And that breakpoint, you have full Visual Studio debugging just as you would expect to have. So again, leveraging your current knowledge and your current skill set, and leveraging the functionality in Visual Studio, just making it all work together for Windows Azure. So if I now hit F5, and I go back to this UI, you can see that I will get a message here. Oh, hello from Windows Azure. I was wondering if which instance I was actually going to get it in. I actually happened to pick the right one. There is a software load balancer that will route incoming traffic to the various different role instances you have running, even locally. So, sometimes IE is a little bit clever, so you might have to use multiple instances of IE to actually hit multiple role instances, but you can definitely do that locally. Okay, so that all worked. We got the configuration from the configuration file, and everything worked as expected. Now, I haven't actually changed anything or stopped debugging or anything like that. I'm going to open up this worker role. And I mentioned this before. You just override a method here, start, and you just write your code here. The sample template just contains a while loop that just spins. So if I set a breakpoint here, and I'm still running, I just hit a breakpoint in my web role, I'm now going to actually hit a breakpoint in my worker role as well. So what that actually shows you is that you can debug across roles. and you can debug across instances. So when you actually think about what's happening under the hood and what's happening in the Windows Azure context, you go, oh, wow, that's great. But when you come back to the Visual Studio experience you expect, you don't even care about that. It just works the way you want it. And in fact, if we do our job well, you won't even know about the Visual Studio tools. They'll just do what you want, and you'll just say, hey, I'm productive, and it's easy to develop for Windows Azure. OK, so I'll remove that breakpoint. And I want to show you one more thing here. I'm going to bring up the Task Manager. And I'm going to show you that actually there's 3 processes running here, rdrollhost.exe, two instances of rdrollhost.exe, and 1 RD runtime loader. As you might expect, rdrollhost corresponds to the 2 instances of the web role that I spun up. And RD runtime loader corresponds to the worker role. So you can actually see that correspondence. In the real cloud, we spin you up in a process, and we put you in your own VM. So you actually harness the power of that VM. On the local version, we don't spin up VMs for you, but we do isolate you in different processes to mimic or simulate that as best we can. So just be aware that we're attached to all those processes when you're debugging, and things just work as you would expect. OK, so we're still in the middle of this edit, build, debug cycle. And I'm going to flip over to a different instance of Visual Studio, which I had already set up. Whoops. And that one actually is almost the same. It's very simple, it's very basic, but it has something quite a bit different in it. It has a native project in here. So this is a Win32 just C++ application. Okay, and it's really simple. It's got a native add method here, which takes 2 numbers and returns a sum. But you can see here, you know, it's including a header file. It's got standard AFX.h. And in the code behind, all I have is on page load, I'm going to set a label, and I'm setting that to a string that's output by calling or p-invoking to that native add. Now, for those of you who have tried this prior to MIX, you're going to be very familiar with what occurs. When you actually come up, you're going to get a security exception. Bummer. You mean I can't call native code? You mean I can't p-invoke? I got a lot of libraries that are useful for me in my website that I want to use. How do I make use of that? And we heard that feedback. The other thing is there's other full trust functionality and APIs that people want to call that haven't been working and fail in a similar way. I had someone email me about Virtual Path Provider. They want to get it to work, and they would get something like this. All right, so I closed that off, and I'm going to show you what's new for this CTP, the March 2009 or MIX CTP. Under the web role, I'm going to click space here, and I'm going to get IntelliSense, just as you would expect in Visual Studio. And I'm going to set this native code execution flag to true. And native code execution actually means full trust. For managed developers, it means give me full trust. And that's what it does. So now that I've set that flag and I hit F5, I'm actually able to get that to work. And so native code, full trust, is now working in the cloud. One thing to be very aware of when you're developing or p-invoking to native code is that Windows Azure actually runs on 64-bit, and your processes are 64-bit. So if you have 32-bit libraries, you know, you could spawn a process off or something to call those if you can't recompile them to 64-bit. But just be aware of that. The final thing which I just want to show you here in Visual Studio is that I actually can set breakpoints as well. So I can set a breakpoint here in the native code, and I go here to the web role and I say, OK, I actually want to enable, under the web tab, I want project properties there, I can set which debugger I want to use. So I can click, I want to add the native debugger. So I save that, and I hit F5. And on load, I'm just going to hit that breakpoint as expected. There it goes. And so you have full native debugging as well. All right, I have 1 minute left, so let me flip back to the slides. And I just want to recap some of the key takeaways from what you just saw. One, we help you build Windows Azure Cloud Services. And we think about this in terms of create, edit, build, debug, and publish. So we want to help you throughout that whole life cycle, end to end, and make it easy for you to be successful with Windows Azure. And we have this local simulation, which improves your productivity because you don't have to upload and deploy to the cloud every time you want to see it run. Finally, we want you to leverage your existing skill set. And there's a big community around ASP.NET and a lot of resources out there. We want you to leverage those as well. Finally, some resources. You can grab the deck and get some resources which will help you to further your knowledge from here. And that's it. And actually, I just ran out of time. So I don't have time for questions, but I'll be outside and stick around to answer any questions you might have. And I've also been asked, please fill out the session evaluation form. Thank you very much for your time.